Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci de rejoindre cette séance du Club du CEPII en milieu d'après-midi à un horaire qui est inhabituel, mais qui permet de jeter un pont entre les deux rives de l'Atlantique. Et nous sommes très heureux d'accueillir Romain Duval, qui est directeur adjoint de la recherche économique au Fonds monétaire international. Il va nous présenter une étude qu'il a réalisée avec un certain nombre de ses collègues sur le marché du travail post-Covid dans les pays développés. Alors, très brièvement, Romain, pour celles et ceux qui ne le connaissent pas, est un économiste titulaire d'un doctorat de l'Université de Paris 1 et qui a fait ses premiers pas au ministère des Finances à Paris, mais qui est très rapidement allé travailler dans la sphère internationale. Il a passé plus de 10 ans, je crois, à l'OCDE et 10 ans au FMI. Et durant ces 20 années dans ce que compte de plus prestigieux les institutions, en termes d'institutions, ce que l'on compte de plus prestigieux en termes d'institutions internationales sur le plan économique, Romain s'est spécialisé essentiellement sur les questions structurelles et notamment sur le marché de l'emploi. Il va donc nous présenter le travail réalisé avec plusieurs collègues sur les conséquences du Covid pour les marchés du travail dans les pays développés, conséquences ou situations post-Covid. On verra quels sont les liens avec le Covid lui-même. Et c'est une situation paradoxale puisque on a à la fois des offres d'emploi non pourvues et un emploi qui ne s'est pas totalement rétabli au niveau antérieur. Les données peuvent varier en fonction des pays, mais c'est la situation générale. Donc, Romain va nous présenter une analyse rigoureuse de ce phénomène, de sa réalité, de son ampleur. Il va peut-être nous expliquer sur le point de savoir s'il s'agit d'une accélération d'une tendance antérieure ou d'un phénomène complètement nouveau. Et peut-être aussi va-t-il nous dire si c'est un phénomène temporaire ou permanent. Il va, je crois, aussi s'attarder sur les causes, à quoi tient le déclin de la population active sur certains métiers. Est-ce que c'est lié à des questions, à des effets directs du Covid, à des questions de difficultés de certaines classes d'âge, notamment liées à la garde d'enfants? Est-ce que c'est lié à la détérioration de certains emplois? Est-ce que c'est lié, on en parle beaucoup, au changement de préférence des travailleurs? Est-ce que c'est lié au retour dans leur pays d'origine dans son pays d'origine d'une partie de la main-d'œuvre étrangère? Et puis, on s'interrogera également sur les conditions dans lesquelles l'ajustement du marché du travail, donc entre offre et demande de travail, s'effectue dans le monde d'après, dans le monde post-Covid. Et puis finalement, on va s'intéresser aux conséquences de ce phénomène. Et dans le contexte actuel, on pense bien sûr à l'impact de ce phénomène sur l'inflation. Ce phénomène a-t-il des effets directs sur les salaires, des effets induits sur les prix de production? Est-ce qu'il y a des phénomènes de second tour qui pourraient accélérer l'inflation? Mais il y a aussi d'autres questions plus structurelles à se poser, notamment en termes de réallocation sectorielle. Est-ce que c'est un phénomène qui est annonciateur d'une réallocation sectorielle de la main-d'œuvre à la faveur de la crise sanitaire? Last but not least, on pourra discuter des recommandations que fait le fonds pour que ce phénomène ne devienne pas, et là je cite l'étude, une malédiction. Donc merci beaucoup Romain. Tu vas t'exprimer en anglais, l'étude est en anglais aussi. On aura un petit moment d'échange à la fin de ton intervention et les questions pourront être posées indifféremment en anglais ou en français. So, Romain, the floor is yours.
Absolument, merci beaucoup Christophe. Merci beaucoup à toi et au CEPII de nous accueillir aujourd'hui tout d'abord. C'est un plaisir. Je vais faire une toute petite introduction en français et ensuite vais présenter les slides. Comme ils sont en anglais, je pensais que ce serait plus efficace pour moi de les présenter en anglais et ça laissera davantage de temps pour la discussion à la fin. À vrai dire, je vais commencer par peut-être répondre à une des questions que tu as posées, qui est une des motivations précisément de ce papier. La crise financière de 2008-2009 avait accéléré l'automatisation, elle avait accéléré la polarisation du marché du travail, notamment le déclin relatif des classes moyennes. Elle avait généré beaucoup de réallocation de ressources. Et lorsque cette crise a commencé, la crise du Covid, on pensait, le consensus parmi les économistes était que cette crise allait davantage encore accélérer l'automatisation, du fait de l'incitation évidemment que fournissait le Covid lui-même, qu'elle allait générer aussi, du fait des changements dans la structure de la demande, d'importants mouvements de réallocation des travailleurs, et qu'elle risquait aussi de générer du chômage d'hystérèse pour très longtemps. Or, un an et demi plus tard, il était assez clair, déjà au cours de la deuxième moitié de 2021, que ce diagnostic avait été trop pessimiste et que ce n'était pas exactement ce qui s'était passé. Donc, et à vrai dire qu'on commençait même à voir des tensions sur le marché du travail. Donc, la question est de savoir pourquoi. Et c'est ce qui a motivé finalement ce papier. Alors, je vais partager les slides et passer à l'anglais en espérant que… Pourquoi ça? Voilà. OK. OK. Can you see the slides? Okay.
Aye.
Okay. So, so the motivation for this work is that there is now a COVID-19 puzzle in the labor market, especially in English-speaking economies, but a bit more broadly. And the puzzle consists of two parts. One part is that now vacancies have soared way above pre-COVID levels. So there's really signs of labor market tightness across advanced economies, but in particular in English-speaking advanced economies, you can see it on the left chart here, which shows you vacancy levels in deviation from pre-COVID levels. And as you can see, vacancies are now 50 to 80% above pre-COVID levels in Australia, Canada, the UK, and the US. And in continental Europe, as data keep coming in for 2021 Q4, so pre-Ukraine war, of course, we also see a similar phenomenon, although less acute. The recovery has been very broad-based across sectors. If you classify sectors according to their degree of contact intensity and their degree of teleworkability, what you see in the middle chart is actually that all types of industries, whether they were hard hit by COVID or not, have seen a very sharp recovery in vacancies. And if anything, it's the sectors that were hard hit by COVID, so the more contact intensive, less teleworkable sectors, that have seen the sharper recovery in vacancies. And now if you look at a standard measure for, the most standard measure for labor market tightness, which is vacancy to unemployment ratios on the right, you see that vacancy to unemployment ratios in 2021 Q3, the blue bars, were above pre-COVID levels in most countries. And if you look at 2021 Q4, as data again keep coming in, and these are the red dots, you see that tightness has increased even further and is now way, way above pre-COVID levels. Okay, in the US, you've got a vacancy to unemployment ratio that is almost 45% above pre-COVID levels. And why is there a bit of a puzzle? It's because although the jobs recovery has been very strong, concomitant with the rise in vacancies, it's not been commensurate to the rise in vacancies because the jobs recovery remain incomplete. It's been again solid, but remains incomplete. You can see that on the left chart, which shows you Employment rates. Employment rates in the different areas are still below pre-COVID levels, although they're very close now. And in France, as you know, unemployment is even below pre-COVID levels now. So in Europe, they are very close to pre-COVID levels now. But in some other regions, they are still significantly below. And also, if you compute employment rates and participation rates in deviation from pre-COVID trends, which arguably is the right thing to do, and you see that in the middle chart, then you see that there's still slack also in some continental European countries, right? You see it here in this chart. If you look at, say, Germany, or Sweden, Austria, Portugal, Spain, it's still pretty clear. And why is that? It's because pre-COVID, there was an upward trend in labor force participation and employment rates in many regions. In continental Europe, there was a trend rise in the participation of older workers, following pension reforms for the most part. In Japan, there was a trend rise in female labor force participation, following reforms that boosted, that incentivized female labor force participation. So quite a lot of slack if you compute the employment rates, in participation rates in deviation from these pre-COVID trends. So this is for the extensive margin. And if you look at the intensive margin, which is average hours worked, you see on the right that we're still below pre-COVID levels in terms of average hours worked per worker in most regions. And as we know, particularly in continental Europe, this is really one, the key margin through which the labor market adjusted during the crisis because of the extensive reliance on so-called job retention schemes like partial unemployment benefits or short-time work schemes, including in France. So you might think, okay, we've seen a strong jobs market recovery. Maybe that's all reflective of the very strong economic recovery that we've seen, which was underpinned by stimulus. And there's some of that, right? If you look, for example, at a simple correlation between the change in the vacancy to unemployment ratio vis-a-vis pre-COVID and the magnitude of the fiscal support to households that was given during COVID, you see that, well, there's indeed some of the countries that have seen the biggest increases in labor market tightness have seen some of the biggest fiscal responses to the COVID crisis. These include, the US, Canada, Australia to some extent. That said, that's not, anywhere near a very strong relationship, but there's some of that for sure. But more importantly, the strength of the recovery and the strength of the fiscal stimulus that underpinned it can explain why you would have an equally strong recovery in vacancies and employment and hours worked. But what we are after here is, after explaining the slight disconnect that we see between a very strong recovery in vacancies and a not so strong recovery in employment and hours worked. Again, solid, but clearly much less than that of tightness. So we want to explain this disconnect. And more precisely, we want to think about why are jobs plentiful right now? Why are there tons of vacancies while workers are still comparatively scarce? Second, what has been the impact of increased labor market tightness on wages? And finally, I'll say a few words about which policies could help ensure that tightness remains, so we say, a blessing, not a curse. And what we mean by that is, you want to aim for the sweet spot where tightness keeps, bringing back disadvantaged workers into the labor force, creating jobs, lowering unemployment, but that's the curse part, but without fueling excessive inflationary pressures that would end up, in greater than anticipated tightening of monetary policies that would eventually backfire on those same workers that are benefiting right now from this strong jobs market recovery. So the key findings up front are the following. One is that tight labor markets partly reflect reduced labor force participation among disadvantaged groups, and in particular, low-skilled workers. Low-skilled workers account for 2/3 of the employment rate gap vis-a-vis pre-COVID levels in the median advanced country. And older workers account for about 1/3 of that aggregate employment rate gap vis-a-vis pre-COVID. And that has shrunk the pool of job seekers in some countries, most prominently, it's fair to say, in the US, Canada, the UK, a bit more than in continental Europe. I'll come back to that. Now, the pandemic itself explains in good part why these workers have remained out of the labor market, and in particular think of health concerns among older workers. I'll come back to that have kept them out of the labor force. A second factor that explains, again, this sort of disconnect between a sharp rise in vacancies and more modest increase in employment is the fact that, at least for the US, there's some area of evidence that there's been a change in worker preferences. And in particular, you see low-skilled workers increasingly moving away from certain types of jobs. And then, contact-intensive, physically strenuous, little flexible jobs. And that's creating frictions in the labor market. A third factor that's creating frictions in the labor market is sectoral and occupational mismatch. We find, what do we mean by that? We mean that if job losses are concentrated in certain sectors or occupations, while job creation is concentrated in other sectors or other occupations, then there might be a skills mismatch the unemployed may be facing. Right? You lose your job in a contact-intensive industry, like hotels and restaurants, and new jobs are being created in IT. So there's some of that during this crisis, but in fact, there was a lot more of that in 2020 than afterwards. And that's simply because, as I've already shown you, you saw the vacancy chart, the hard hit industries have recovered very strongly, in fact. So that sectoral and occupational mismatch has declined. And now we estimate that it accounts for just about 10% of the remaining employment rate gap vis-a-vis pre-COVID in the median advanced country. When exploring the implications for wage growth, what we find, we did this analysis for the US and the UK, for which we had granular data, and we could discriminate between low-pay industries and other industries. What we find is that tightness has pushed up wage growth, especially for low-pay jobs, by 4 to 6 percentage points at an annual rate in the US and the UK since the spring of 2020, so quite substantial. But the overall impact has been about 1.5 percentage points. That is, annual wage growth is about 1.5, nominal annual wage growth is about 1.5 percentage point higher than it would be if we had not seen the increase in tightness that we've seen since late spring of 2020. And finally, at this point in time, and leaving aside monetary policy implications of this, which I'm sure we will discuss, a win-win policy would be to bring back more workers into the labor force. And that's because it would curb labor market pressures and inflationary risk, while at the same time making this recovery more inclusive, especially if you are able to bring back more low-skilled workers into the labor force at this point. So why are jobs plentiful while workers are still rather scarce? So we put forward 3 explanations, and the first one is the pandemic itself. So the left chart shows you the contributions to the aggregate employment rate gap of low-skilled workers, and that's the blue bars, and the older workers, the orange bars. And as you can see, the red dots show you the aggregate employment rate gap vis-a-vis pre-COVID. And as you can see, low-skilled workers in many countries account for the bulk, or if not all, or even more than 100% of the aggregate employment rate gap vis-a-vis pre-COVID, right? You can see it here for example, for the UK, low-skilled workers account for over 100% of the remaining employment gap vis-a-vis pre-COVID. And that's because high-skilled workers actually now have employment rates that are above pre-COVID levels. In the US, if you look at the contributions of low-skilled workers, blue bar, and older workers, orange bar, you see that the sum of these 2 contributions is about 2/3. So 2/3 of the remaining aggregate employment gap is accounted for by these 2 groups. And it is no coincidence that low-skilled workers were hit harder by the pandemic because they were overrepresented in contact-intensive and less teleworkable jobs. And it is also no coincidence that older workers face the greatest health risks from COVID. There's another explanation that has been floated around for why older workers withdrew from the labor force in the wake of COVID, especially in countries that have defined contribution pension schemes. And that's the asset price boom that we saw, right? After the initial collapse in the spring of 2020, at least until late 2021, we saw a very significant rise in asset prices, including equity prices across advanced economies. And it's been argued that it may have pushed some older workers out of the labor force. But in fact, when we do in the paper some more micro analysis looking at the profile of older workers that have left the labor force during COVID, we find that in fact, these are mostly home renters, not homeowners. We find that they are predominantly low skilled, not high skilled. So these are not the workers that really benefited from an increase in the value of their pension plans. And as a result, clearly it's the health concerns that have dominated the drivers of the reduction in labor force participation of older workers. And in the US, there's been a specific factor that you can see on the right, which is the rise, very persistent rise in the inactivity of mothers with young children, children aged less than 5. If you look at the trend in a few countries here, right, and the evolution of this inactivity rate in the wake of COVID, you see that in the US, inactivity of women with young children increased and stayed actually persistently above pre-COVID levels, which has not been the case in those other few countries for which we have micro data here and for which we did this calculation. So the pandemic itself has played a role, and it's even more striking for low-skilled workers that they actually have plentiful job opportunities right now. These charts show you the distribution of vacancies across all occupations for 3 countries, and we also did it for the US, for which we have the data. This chart uses Indeed data. So Indeed is a jobs aggregator website, and we developed an algorithm that maps the job titles in those Indeed job vacancies to occupational codes, and then we could check what type of vacancies have increased the most, what types of occupations have seen the biggest increases, and also importantly, whether these are predominantly low-skilled workers that have seen the biggest increases in vacancies. And if you just focus on the, say, take the left chart, Australia, if you just focus on the gray area, which shows you the 10th to 19th percentile of the distribution of vacancies across all occupations, and if you compare that to the black dotted line here, which shows you the 19th percentile for low-wage occupations, what you see is that the rise in vacancies has been sharper, in fact, for a whole fraction of low-wage occupations than it's been for other jobs. So really the surprising feature of this crisis is that we see rising pressure, rising labor market tensions on some low-wage jobs, which frankly is, I think, runs completely counter to what anyone would have predicted, I think, in the spring of 2020. And that reflects also well-known shortages for some specific occupations that you've seen in the press. So, we know there's shortages in construction, and these are the green lines here. You see a very sharp increase in the job vacancies in construction. We've seen shortages of truck drivers, that's been also in the press, warehouse workers, which has led Amazon, for example, in the UK to raise its minimum wage quite sharply to try and retain and attract warehouse workers. But you see that, of course, that it's not broad-based across all countries, across all occupations, and some occupations that have been very hard hit by COVID have remained depressed. And you see it, for example, for shop sales assistants, given the hit to retail trade. If you look at, say, Canada and the UK, here you see that for shop sales assistants, the fall in vacancy has been quite dramatic, and it's one area where they've not recovered. The second reason why we see this plentiful job vacancies and workers not fully taking them is a change in worker preferences. That's most of, so there's no silver bullet on that. I think there needs to be more research on this. But clearly for the US, there's an array of of evidence. One piece of evidence is in this relationship that you see here between the vacancy to unemployment ratio, so between tightness, and the voluntary quit rate, which is on the y-axis here. And as you can see historically, so each observation is, I think is a month. Yes, it's a month. And the whole relationship is plotted since the early 2000s. And as you can see, historically, there's a very strong relationship between the two. And that's because when tightness is high, when there's lots of vacancies per unemployed, workers are going to seize those opportunities in a hot labor market. They're going to voluntarily quit their jobs to take up better job opportunities that pay better or offer better working conditions. And that's featured here in this black dotted line on the chart. But if you look at the latest observations for 2021, so the red diamonds, what you see is that the quit rate is above, significantly above what this relationship with tightness would predict. Right? The quit rate in the US is at a historical high, at least as measured by using JOLTS, because there's different sources and a whole technical discussion in the US about quit rates, but clearly the mainstream source is JOLTS, and according to that metric, the quit rate is at a historical high, as you can see here actually. And it's these excess quits, relative to the rise in tightness, are really suggestive of a change in worker preferences, and in particular the search for better working conditions, and not just workers seizing opportunities in a hot labor market. And another piece of evidence that suggests that is that if you use micro data to look at workers' transitions from jobs to jobs on the left chart, and if you look at all these transitions, okay, in a given period, and if you look among all of these transitions at what was the share of transitions away from contact-intensive jobs, what you see, for example, here in the UK, it's pretty clear, but you also see it in the US, relative to pre-COVID, there's a higher share of transitions from job to jobs that are accounted for by people leaving contact-intensive jobs. And as a result, vacancy to employment ratios in contact-intensive sectors are particularly high and disproportionately high actually today, which again is sort of runs counter to what we would have thought, I think, in the early days of COVID. And also, if you look at those industries that have seen the biggest increases in quits here in the US and the UK, what you see is that these are industries that have disproportionately large share of jobs that are contact intensive, physically strenuous, have little flexibility on working arrangements, either schedules or at least teleworkability, and it's very clear for retail trade, it's very clear for accommodation and food services, transportation and storage. For the US, you see that there's also been a very big rise in quits in non-durable goods manufacturing, and that one is a bit specific, does not reflect exactly what I just said. It reflects in good part the very large shift in consumption away from services towards goods that we saw in the US during the crisis. It's a shift that has happened pretty much everywhere, but has been particularly dramatic in the US. Let's keep this one. Yeah. Now, the third factor is occupational and sectoral mismatch. So as I mentioned at the outset, sectoral and occupational mismatch is a misalignment between job searchers' characteristics, which sector they come from, which occupation they used to have, and the job vacancies that are out there. So we do this analysis for 6 countries here. Actually, yeah, it's 6, not 5. And we do it at the industry level, except for Japan and Canada, for which we had big data only at the occupational level. And that's because, to do this kind of exercise, you need to have individual job vacancies by types of occupations, by sectors, and you also need to have hires data, so data on hires by occupation or by sector. The methodology we apply is the methodology used by Sahin, Song, Topa, and Violante in a pretty famous AR paper from 2014. It's a paper that tried to look at whether the global financial crisis had increased job mismatch. For those of you who remember the debates post-global financial crisis, the debate was very much symmetric to what we're debating today. That is, the debate was that we were facing a jobless recovery, that there was perhaps a big increase in mismatch because of the permanent contraction of construction, manufacturing, some parts of finance, and these workers that were laid off could not easily be reallocated to other jobs and industries. So there was a debate as to whether structural unemployment had increased as a result of the global financial crisis on account of mismatch. And so the methodology, I'm happy to discuss it, but in a nutshell, it's a methodology that assumes segmented labor market, either segmented by occupation or by sector, meaning if you're laid off from one sector, you search in that sector. If you're laid off from one occupation, you search in that occupation. Although we do a robustness check, in fact, where we allow job seekers to search in other sectors, and we don't find, actually, surprisingly, as far as I'm concerned, we don't find different results, really. And the intuition behind this is that you assume a social planner that is going to maximize total highs in the economy. And to maximize total highs in the economy, a social planner would allocate workers across occupations or across sectors in a way that would equalize tightness across industries or across occupations. Why is that? Intuitively, you can see that if you have a large dispersion in vacancy to unemployment ratios across sectors, that means that there's some labor markets that are slack, some that are really tight, and workers are not moving from the slack labor market to the tight labor market to equalize the vacancy to unemployment ratios. So if this is happening, that is suggestive of mismatch. Okay? And then what we do is we compute an index of mismatch, which is the fraction of new highs foregone due to misallocation. And we also compute the employment loss due to mismatch as a percentage of the working age population. And when we do that, what we find on the left, you can see it is that mismatch, so the mismatch index, the fraction of highs foregone due to mismatch, increased in the first year of COVID. And that largely reflected the contraction of all the contact-intensive, non-teleworkable jobs and industries. But you can see that as these industries and jobs recovered, mismatch declined. And basically the story has really been one where certain types of jobs and industries contracted big time, others expanded, so that created temporary mismatch. But then as these hard-hit industries themselves ended up recovering, sometimes more strongly than we thought initially, I think hotels, restaurants, recreation services, mismatch declined. And so much so that, when we look at the contribution of mismatch to the employment rate gap right now, which is shown here on the right chart, if you look, say, just at the US, you see that at the peak, which was 2020 Q3, mismatch accounted for about 1 percentage point employment rate gap vis-a-vis pre-COVID, meaning because of mismatch, the employment rate was 1 percentage point below its pre-COVID level. But as you can see, our latest estimates is just a fraction of that. That is, for 2021 Q4, our estimate is that mismatch now accounts for about, I think, 0.3 percentage points lower employment rate vis-a-vis pre-COVID. So that brings me, so these were for the 3 explanations, and that brings me to a different part, and now closely towards the end, which is regarding the implications of tightness for wage growth. So first of all, it is clear that, at least in the US and the UK, tightness is fostering wage growth. You can see it here for the US in the left chart, which shows you the relationship between the deviation of tightness, so the vacancy to unemployment ratio, from its pre-COVID level, that's the x-axis, and the deviation of wage growth, nominal wage growth for now, from its pre-COVID growth rate. And that's on the y-axis. So clearly, some of the industries that have seen some of the biggest increases in tightness, like accommodation and food services, manufacturing non-durables, have seen some of the biggest increases in wage growth. And some of the industries that have been more depressed, such as transportation, have seen a reduction in wage growth vis-à-vis pre-crisis. And because many of the, as I've already shown you, in my vacancy chart, right, by skill level, because in many of these industries that have seen the biggest increase in tightness, actually jobs are predominantly low skilled, or it's in those industries, low skilled jobs that have seen the biggest increases in vacancies. This has led to faster wage growth for low-skilled workers than for higher-skilled workers, which is also a peculiarity of this crisis. And you can see it on the right chart, which is based on the Atlanta Fed tracker. You see that for the first quartile of the distribution, right, wage growth has picked up quite substantially and much more than for example, the fourth quartile of the distribution, which is the blue line here. And interestingly, you can see that this is very much in reverse to what happened during the global financial crisis. In the years after the global financial crisis, it's low-skilled wages that dropped most vis-a-vis high-skilled wages. So very much the mirror image this time around. And it's mostly new highs that are taking advantage of this increased bargaining power of workers in some of the hot labor markets. These two charts show you the nominal hourly wage path of new highs versus incumbent workers. New highs are defined here as having a tenure of less than 1 month for the US or less than 3 months, because these are quarterly data for the UK. And in both cases, you see that recently, wage growth has been faster for new highs than it's been for incumbent workers. And that's suggestive of workers' bargaining power having increased and connected to this increase in quit rates, where workers are getting higher pay and also better working conditions. And that's also suggestive of a potential catch-up for incumbent workers going forward. And as you can see, actually, also as you would expect, over the long term, both lines match pretty well, because eventually incumbents' wages catch up on those of new highs, right, through internal wage bargaining. So that's also suggestive of increased wage pressures in the labor market. Now, if you look historically, the relationship between tightness and wage growth has been steeper for low-pay industries and low-pay jobs than for other types of jobs. You can see it very well on these two charts. On the left for the US, on the right for the UK. These charts plot at the industry level. Okay, at the industry level, each observation is an industry quarter observation. This chart plots you tightness, the vacancy to unemployment ratio for that industry, where the unemployment is a pseudo-unemployment. That is, it's the employment in the food and accommodation industry would be the share of those unemployed workers who previously worked in accommodation and food services. So it's a pseudo-unemployment rate. So this chart plots you tightness, vacancy to pseudo-unemployment ratio in the x-axis against wage inflation on the y-axis for low-pay industries in red and other industries in blue. Low-pay industries are here accommodation and food services, retail trade, arts and entertainment for the US, and there's a slight difference for the UK, but these are mostly the same industries in the UK. And as you can see, when tightness increases, wage growth increases, but it increases more in low-pay industries than in others. And so, there's two reasons then why tightness has pushed up wage growth in the US and the UK. The first reason is that tightness has increased more for low-pay industries and low-pay jobs in both countries. And second, a given rise in tightness triggers a bigger increase in wages in those types of industries or jobs. And to take that to the data and you know, come up with a quantitative estimate, what we do is we estimate wage Phillips curves at the industry level. There's a long story, of course, you know, long history of estimating wage Phillips curve. They all have serious flaws, by the way. A key one being serious omitted variable bias and endogeneity issues more broadly. So when you estimate them at the industry level, you mitigate such bias because you can control for all economy-wide factors that are going to affect wage bargaining in each industry equally. For example, terms of trade shocks, for example, price expectations. And so here we estimate this wage Phillips curve at the industry level. The key variable of interest for us here is this coefficient on labor market tightness, which is lagged to mitigate endogeneity issues. What further mitigates endogeneity issues is the fact that you can control for the expected, okay, you can have backward-looking inflation expectations, forward-looking, a mix of the two. We tried many different specifications, and actually the coefficient on tightness didn't really vary that much. So clearly the results are robust to this control, to how you specify price expectations in the equation. We also control for productivity growth at the economy-wide level, and very importantly, an industry fixed effect that is going to address a good source of a good fraction of the omitted variable bias that such regressions can entail. And to look at whether the effects of tightness on wage growth are bigger in low-pay industries, what we do is we simply interact the tightness indicator with a low-pay industry dummy in an extended specification. And when we do that, what we obtain is that, I won't show you the results from this kind of specification, they're all in the paper. But when you do that, what you get is then if you plug the increase in tightness that we've seen since late spring 2020 into this kind of equation, what you obtain is that in the US, the direct contribution of the increase in tightness to wage inflation has been about 1.5 percentage points at an annual rate, okay, since the spring of 2020. So again, wage growth is about 1.5 percentage point higher today than it would be if tightness had not increased. But as you can see for low-pay industries, this is about 4 percentage points higher at an annual rate, and that's consistent, you know, with just the facts which I showed you earlier on, the Atlanta Fed Tracker data, which shows actually faster wage growth for low-wage workers. I won't explain the last two bars, but that gives you a sense of what this is about. Now, with all of that, though, with all these labor market pressures and the resulting acceleration in wages in the US and UK at least, much less so far in continental Europe, and maybe that's something we're going to discuss. So despite those labor market pressures and increases in nominal wage growth, real wage growth so far has been negative in most countries over the past year, or a small positive in some other countries. And that's primarily because of the big inflation surprise, of course, that we've witnessed. And that raises really concerns going forward of you know, what concerns regarding an environment in which you have very tight labor markets, and on the other hand, negative or very low real wage growth for workers. And this is an environment that may be ripe, you know, for a sharp wage pickup, and it will depend fundamentally on the extent to which workers are going to be able to get compensated for the large price surprise that we've seen in the last year. And if they were to be compensated, by the way, you can see already from the numbers that I presented you that this would be actually a bigger, you know, wage impact. This would entail a bigger wage impact than the increase in tightness has done so far. The increase in tightness has raised annual wage growth by about 1.5 percentage points in the US, but think that if workers were to get compensated in full for the recent inflation surprise, you know, we're talking about here of a compensation of in the order of 5 to 6 percentage points, right? That's the amount of the surprise. So it's a multiple of what the impact of tightness on wage growth has been. So this is really, this issue of compensation for recent inflation is really crucial. And in theory, in economic theory, there would be compensation because workers and employers bargain on real wage levels. They don't bargain on real wage growth. So bygones are not bygones. There should be a catch-up. Now, in practice, so far, we've not seen that much of a catch-up yet in most countries, but there's mechanisms in place that can trigger it. And we've got, for example, minimum wage indexation to prices in many countries. France is one. And of course, recent price inflation is starting feeding into wage negotiations in many countries. And I'm finishing here, so with the last slide on policy implications. So clearly, there's an implication for monetary policy, which is to make sure that we alleviate any large second round effects of the price inflation surprise on wages. There can be some second round effects actually in Europe because that may even help reach the inflation target of the ECB over the medium term. But clearly there cannot be a full second round effect and a full compensation for the price surprise that we've seen, as this would otherwise run the risk of triggering a price wage spiral and could lead to greater than anticipated monetary policy tightening, and again that would potentially backfire actually on workers and trigger an economic slowdown. So leaving those monetary policy implications aside, what's really key is to bring more workers back into the labor force to address labor shortages, because that would curb labor market pressures and inflationary risk while making this recovery more inclusive, especially if you're able to bring back low-skilled workers. To do that, keeping control of the pandemic remains paramount. It will bring back more older workers into the labor force. In the US, also women with young children who can come back in full, and they are actually starting slowly coming back in full. So keeping control of the pandemic will be key in that regard. There are also some active labor market policies that could be particularly helpful at the current juncture. Active labor market policies come in multiple forms, and the literature about their effectiveness is actually, frankly, pretty disappointing. But at this point in time, there are some programs that would seem to make a lot of sense, in particular targeted short-term training programs that would be focused on addressing specific job shortages. There are professions right now that are seeing shortages and in which the required skills can be acquired within a reasonable time frame. Think care workers, truck drivers, for example. There is also, coming out of this crisis, a debate to be had on labor laws and regulations to facilitate telework. That's a big demand of workers. It is a lot more difficult for many low-skilled workers than for others. And there is really a scope for bargaining here among employers and employees, but also for laws and regulations by governments. And here, the idea will be to reconcile the sometimes conflicting, interests of workers and employers. Right? For workers, for employers, having workers that are on call 24/7 is ideal, but that's clearly not ideal for workers. And for workers, having a private life totally protected after, say, 5 p.m., as is now the case in Portugal, is ideal, but then this disincentivizes employers from offering telework. So clearly, there's a need for negotiation and compromise in this area to facilitate telework. One area I did not have time to discuss is immigration, and in fact, we've got good micro work in the paper where we show that in those industries that have seen the biggest declines in immigration in the UK, Canada, and also Australia, the increase in shortages has been bigger, and that's especially the case among low-pay industries. So clearly, where immigration amplified the labor shortages, its resumption could ease those labor shortages right now, and that's very much the case everywhere. In the case of the UK, actually, this had started with Brexit and was amplified by the COVID crisis, and has amplified labor shortages. And finally, I want to finish with a longer-term conclusion, which is that mainstreaming job retention schemes, so partial unemployment benefits, short-time work schemes, these can help keep disadvantaged workers attached to the labor force after major temporary shocks. We saw that during the global financial crisis. We saw that again during this crisis on a much bigger scale. And that also avoids large swings in labor market tightness. And that accounts for why the situation in continental Europe has been different from the situation we've seen in the US. Think, for example, that in the US, the leisure and hospitality industry lost half of its workforce at the peak of the crisis, but then recovered very strongly, so had to hire back, right? And that created a lot of frictions because people move on, they move geographically, they move to other jobs, etc. They move to other firms. And these frictions clearly could have been avoided and were avoided in many continental European countries by job retention schemes. And likewise, if you think of older workers, if all the workers lose their job in the middle of the pandemic, that also creates larger health risks for them, they are much less likely to come back to the labor market, and they're much more likely to permanently retire than if they were protected by a job retention scheme that enabled them to keep their jobs, stay at home, and come back in person only when safe health conditions can be ensured. So that also is another difference between the US on the one hand and continental Europe on the other. At the same time, I don't want to overdo the role of job retention schemes because they were used very extensively in the UK and Australia as well. And yet, UK and Australia have US-style labor market tightness right now, right? And their labor markets don't look very much like continental European labor markets. So clearly, there's much more than job retention schemes, but these have really been helpful. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to discussion.
Merci beaucoup, Romain. Je vais donner à l'audience une petite précision technique. Si vous souhaitez intervenir, vous pouvez cliquer sur un icône en dessous duquel il est marqué « Réaction ». Et là, vous aurez la possibilité de cliquer sur « Lever la main ». Et je vous invite bien sûr à faire vos commentaires ou poser vos questions de cette manière. Je vais commencer la conversation, la brève conversation qu'on va avoir. Pourquoi ne pas avoir choisi dans votre étude, disons, des grandes économies d'Europe continentale? Il y a l'Espagne, souvent, mais il n'y a ni l'Italie, ni l'Allemagne, ni la France. Est-ce que c'est un problème d'accès aux données ou c'est un choix qui résulte d'autres contraintes?
Oui, c'est une combinaison des deux. C'est en partie une question d'accès aux données, par exemple sur les données de vacances d'emploi que nous avions ou concernant le mismatch. Qui demandent des données très granulaires auxquelles nous n'avions pas accès pour ces pays. Donc ça, c'est une des raisons, en effet. Et la seconde raison est que il y a quand même disons, un mystère beaucoup plus clair concernant les pays anglo-saxons que la France, par exemple. Dans le cas de la France, le marché du travail est tendu, mais le taux d'emploi est revenu à son niveau d'avant-crise, donc la reprise du marché du travail a été complète. Donc, il y a un petit peu moins cette déconnexion qu'on peut voir, par exemple, au Royaume-Uni, aux États-Unis ou au Canada, par exemple. Donc ça, c'était une seconde raison pour laquelle on ne s'est pas trop focalisé sur les grandes économies d'Europe continentale. Ceci dit, une troisième raison, c'est que nous avons sorti un autre papier sur les pays d'Europe continentale au mois de février. Notre département Europe a sorti un papier sur le marché du travail des pays d'Europe continentale pendant la crise du Covid, dans laquelle nous avons regardé les effets justement de toutes les mesures de protection de l'emploi, telles que chômage partiel, etc., sur l'emploi au cours du Covid. On a trouvé que Notamment, ces mesures avaient permis de préserver peut-être environ 4 millions d'emplois durant le Covid au total en Europe, ce qui est quand même considérable. Et puis, c'était un papier aussi dans lequel on a regardé quelles étaient les implications du Covid à moyen terme pour l'Europe, notamment en termes de réallocation du travail. Et ce qu'on trouve, c'est que finalement, le Covid est un choc qui va entraîner moins de réallocation que ce que l'on aurait pu penser, encore une fois, au début de la crise, du fait, notamment si on le compare à, par exemple, la réallocation entre secteurs et entre emplois qu'on pouvait déjà prévoir avant le Covid, qui viendrait notamment des transformations de l'économie, transition verte, transition digitale, etc.
Alors, si on file un petit peu la discussion, tu as évoqué les problèmes que la situation que tu décrivais posait en termes de politique monétaire devant l'augmentation nette du risque d'inflation, qui est encore plus forte dans les pays anglo-saxons que en Europe continentale. Est-ce que vous en déduisez des recommandations de politique monétaire, si tant est que vous les formuliez, différentes pour disons, la Fed et la BCE?
Dans notre dernier article 4 sur la zone euro, qui est sorti il y a quelques mois à peine, nous avions mentionné une différence, qui est que dans le cas de l'Europe, pour que la BCE soit à sa cible à moyen terme, un effet de second tour, disons, de la hausse des prix récentes sur les salaires, dans une certaine mesure, ne serait pas une mauvaise chose. Alors que dans le cas des États-Unis, un effet de second tour important des hausses de prix récentes sur les salaires aurait davantage de chances d'entraîner une spirale prix-salaire, sachant que le niveau de départ de l'inflation avant Covid était déjà plus élevé aux États-Unis, la hausse récente est également un peu plus forte, les tensions sur le marché du travail sont beaucoup plus fortes, et donc les risques inflationnistes nous semblent, à moyen terme, nous semblent plus importants.
Je vais donner la parole à Michel Aglietta. J'espère que je le maîtrise bien.
Michel? Oui, vous entendez? Je ne sais pas,
oui.
moi.
On t'entend.
Oui,
on t'entend, Michel. On ne te voit pas, mais on t'entend.
Non, mais ce n'est pas la peine de voir. Donc, oui, je voulais poser une question à Romain qui est la suivante. J'ai bien compris ce qu'il a dit. La tension sur le marché du travail entraîne une hausse des salaires, en particulier pour les moins bien payés, qui va une baisse des inégalités aux États-Unis. Alors là, je comprends assez mal parce que là, on sait que la hausse des prix à la consommation a déjà dépassé 7%. Elle est bien au-dessus de la hausse des salaires, hein, de n'importe quelle hausse des salaires. On a parlé de 6 et quelques, etc. Et donc, le point essentiel, c'est que la Fed, et là, ça renvoie à la politique macro. Ouais, il y a manque de politique macro dans cette analyse. La Fed est extrêmement en retard sur ce qu'elle aurait dû faire. C'est-à-dire, ce que la Fed a fait jusqu'ici, c'est essayer de maintenir le marché boursier, hein, en sorte que la valeur actionnariale puisse continuer et que les marchés boursiers continuent à être extrêmement actifs. Or, le retard qu'elle a rend extrêmement difficile maintenant, et ça c'est bien connu, je veux dire, avec la nature des pressions inflationnistes qu'elle entraîne, la Fed va forcément être obligée d'inverser sa politique monétaire et il est extrêmement peu probable qu'elle puisse le faire sans récession. Et donc, à ce moment-là, si on a une récession par le fait que la Fed essaye de rattraper son retard, elle y est vraiment obligée maintenant, à la fois en politique quantitative et en hausse des taux d'intérêt, qui vont être plus importants que ce qu'on avait cru au début de l'année, de loin, pour cette année. eh bien, d'après les expériences historiques de ce type de situation, il y a de fortes chances qu'il y ait une récession. Et à ce moment-là, tout ce qui est dit là-dessus, évidemment, perd son importance. C'est-à-dire que la récession va entraîner, si vous voulez, une baisse de la situation des travailleurs, quels qu'ils soient. Qu'ils soient des travailleurs à bas salaire ou qu'ils soient les travailleurs à plus haut salaire, etc. Voilà ce que on peut craindre, je veux dire. On ne peut pas penser rien sans penser que la politique monétaire va s'inverser de manière radicale. Donc voilà le problème qui me semble essentiel. Alors l'autre truc, mais très rapidement, sur l'Europe, il est impossible de parler de l'Union européenne sans parler des conséquences de la guerre en Ukraine. Je veux dire, c'est vraiment le risque essentiel pour l'Union européenne. Elle dépend du gaz russe de manière massive, sauf la France. Enfin bon. Et donc, bon, sur l'Union européenne, il n'y a pas d'analyse qui puisse correspondre à la réalité de la situation que nous vivons. Merci beaucoup.
Merci Michel. Romain, sur le bouclage macro et sur les conséquences éventuelles de la guerre.
Merci. Oui, merci Michel. Oui, non, j'aurais dû quand même préciser, ça n'est pas un papier sur la politique monétaire, les conséquences pour la politique monétaire et nos recommandations de politique monétaire pour la Fed au cours des prochains mois. On va sortir le World Economic Outlook la semaine prochaine. Ce sujet va être au cœur des discussions lors des meetings de printemps du FMI qui commencent également la semaine prochaine. À vrai dire même cette semaine pratiquement, parce que maintenant on les a un petit peu espacés dans le temps du fait qu'ils sont en partie en mode virtuel. Donc ce sujet va venir, hein. C'est simplement ce papier que nous avons fait là est totalement complémentaire de cette analyse en ce sens qu'il se focalise sur les aspects de tension sur le marché du travail. Il y a plusieurs facteurs qui vont conduire la Fed, comme toutes les banques centrales, potentiellement à resserrer leur politique monétaire, mais c'est évidemment les anticipations d'inflation, les tensions sur le marché du travail, les surprises du côté de l'offre. Donc, tous ces facteurs sont absolument fondamentaux, mais ici, nous nous sommes focalisés que sur l'un d'entre eux, qui est les tensions sur le marché du travail et comment elles peuvent alimenter les hausses de salaire. Bien sûr, dans mon analyse, quand j'ai dit que les travailleurs les moins qualifiés avaient davantage bénéficié, il était clair que je parlais de revenus relatifs, pas absolus. J'ai été très clair, je pense, quand j'ai montré les salaires réels qui sont en baisse dans la plupart des pays. Donc, bien sûr, il s'agit d'une hausse de revenus relatifs des peu qualifiés, mais en termes réels, au jour d'aujourd'hui, même aux États-Unis, effectivement, la plupart, pratiquement toutes les catégories, en tout cas, vous avez vu les 4 quartiles que j'ai montrés, perdent en termes réels. Donc, ça, c'est tout à fait clair. Et je n'ai pas mentionné également le fait que n'oublions pas que lorsqu'on veut tirer des conclusions un peu plus générales en termes de réduction des inégalités, il y a l'aspect salaire, mais il y a l'aspect emploi. Comme les travailleurs les moins qualifiés sont par ailleurs toujours sont moins employés qu'ils l'étaient avant la crise du Covid, en termes d'impact sur les inégalités, on a un effet positif qui est la hausse des salaires, mais on a un effet négatif qui est la baisse de leur taux d'emploi vis-à-vis celui des travailleurs plus qualifiés. Donc ça, je vais être clair là-dessus. Et concernant la guerre en Ukraine, eh bien, il est évident qu'elle va réduire les tensions sur le marché du travail en Europe continentale. Et ce qui risque de se produire, c'est qu'elle risque en fait d'amplifier cette asymétrie que l'on peut voir entre des pays anglo-saxons d'un côté et les pays d'Europe continentale de l'autre, puisque pour les pays d'Europe continentale, le choc en matière de demande et le choc aussi en matière de prix de l'énergie sera plus important que pour les États-Unis ou le Canada. Et donc, ce qu'on risque d'observer sur le marché du travail, encore une fois, le sujet de cette présentation, je ne parle pas de l'économie européenne et américaine en général, ce qu'on risque d'observer sur le marché du travail, c'est effectivement une dichotomie encore plus importante que celle qu'on voyait déjà dans les données que je vous ai présentées.
Merci. Nicolas Carnot.
Oui, bonjour, bonjour Romain, bonjour Christophe, bonjour à tous. Oui, merci beaucoup pour cette présentation vraiment très, très, très intéressante et ce gros travail là derrière. En fait, dans ta réponse là, Michel, tu as un tout petit peu anticipé sur, je pense, sur la réponse à ma question. Est-ce que j'ai essayé de réconcilier le fait que donc le marché est tendu pour les bas salaires, les relativement peu qualifiés, etc. Donc avec un salaire relativement aux autres qui va plus vite, ce qui contraste avec l'expérience passée, très très frappant. Et le fait que, ce que tu nous as montré au début, les taux d'emploi restent, pour les pays sur lesquels vous focalisez, parce que comme tu l'as remarqué, c'est un peu différent en Europe continentale, ça, nettement en dessous quand même de l'avant-crise. Alors, du coup, on n'arrive pas complètement à boucler. Est-ce qu'on est au plein emploi, et en particulier au plein emploi des peu qualifiés? On aurait plutôt envie de répondre oui, si on répond vite. Et en même temps, comment c'est possible avec ce taux d'emploi? Est-ce que le salaire de réservation, quelque part, et à cause de quoi il a monté? Tu dis que c'est des changements de préférence, donc ça a l'air de renvoyer un peu dans cette direction. Mais donc, voilà, comment ça boucle? Est-ce qu'on est entre emploi et salaire? Et effectivement, est-ce que globalement, alors à l'inflation près, la situation des peu qualifiés en particulier, c'est presque amélioré d'une certaine manière, ou c'est plus compliqué que ça?
Merci, voilà. Oui, c'est une très bonne question. Et j'aurais des éléments partiels de réponse, mais c'est précisément l'une des choses qui a motivé ce papier. L'un des facteurs, c'est la pandémie elle-même. Si tu penses, par exemple, je me focalisais sur les États-Unis, où voilà, la situation est la plus claire, puisque c'est quand même aux États-Unis qu'on voit à la fois les plus fortes tensions sur le marché du travail, la plus forte réaction des salaires au bas de l'échelle, et en même temps le plus fort écart entre le taux d'emploi des peu qualifiés aujourd'hui et celui qu'on pouvait observer avant le Covid. C'est là que le paradoxe que tu mentionnes est peut-être le plus marquant. Un facteur est clairement la pandémie, c'est-à-dire parmi ces travailleurs peu qualifiés, en fait, une bonne portion d'entre eux sont ça je ne l'avais pas mentionné lorsque j'ai fait le résumé au début, les travailleurs âgés et les travailleurs peu qualifiés sont deux groupes qui se recoupent en partie. Donc, il y a une partie de travailleurs peu qualifiés qui ont quitté le marché du travail du fait de la pandémie et ne sont pas revenus du fait de la persistance de cette pandémie. Et notamment, c'est vrai qu'on voit des travailleurs âgés, peu qualifiés, qui ont été licenciés des industries dans lesquelles ils avaient des emplois qui demandaient des emplois de proximité, qui demandaient des contacts, qui n'étaient pas également, qui ne pouvaient pas être exercés en ligne, et ne sont pas revenus. Et c'est précisément un des facteurs qui est en train d'entraîner cette hausse de salaire. Il y a un ajustement, il y a un mécanisme de marché qui est en train, quand tu me demandes comment ça se boucle, il y a un mécanisme de marché qui est en train de se mettre en place, et qu'effectivement, on a des vacances qui ont explosé pour ces types d'emplois, des travailleurs qui ne sont pas entièrement revenus, en partie du fait de la pandémie, en partie certaines femmes, dans le cas des États-Unis, des mères de jeunes enfants. Et donc, le marché est en train de s'équilibrer via ces hausses de salaire qui sont quand même très importantes et qui tranchent avec les hausses qu'on a pu voir au cours des crises précédentes. Donc ça, c'est un mécanisme de marché qui est en train de se mettre en place, qui va atténuer ce problème. Et le second facteur, c'est effectivement ce changement de préférence qui génère beaucoup de turnover sur le marché du travail. C'est-à-dire que les gens quittent les emplois pour essayer d'en trouver de nouveaux qui vont générer davantage qui leur permettront d'obtenir de meilleures conditions de travail. Et ça génère énormément, là aussi, de vacances d'emploi. Il est très intéressant de constater que il y a des entreprises américaines actuellement qui postent 3 vacances d'emploi alors qu'elles n'ont qu'un emploi à pourvoir, par exemple. C'est parce qu'elles anticipent déjà que même si elles arrivent à pourvoir les 3 emplois, les gens vont partir assez vite chercher de nouvelles opportunités. Donc, je pense qu'il y a cet effet de changement de préférence génère aussi un turnover et un excès de vacances d'emploi et qui amplifie cette déconnexion qu'on observe avec le faible taux d'emploi des peu qualifiés. Néanmoins, je pense que cette question mérite encore d'être approfondie et le bouclage n'est pas complet. Le cas américain reste vraiment très étonnant de ce point de vue.
Merci beaucoup. S'il n'y a pas d'autres questions, on va s'arrêter là. Merci Romain pour à la fois cette présentation très, très riche et l'échange que nous avons eu en fin de séance qui, je crois, éclairer la vision qu'on peut avoir du fonctionnement du marché du travail, notamment aux États-Unis, et les enjeux macroéconomiques associés. Je conclus en disant que le club du CEPII, comme le FMI, continue ses réunions en ligne et que nous en avons 2 prévues dans les semaines qui viennent. La semaine prochaine, une réunion sur la Turquie, donc le 20 avril à 15 heures, avec une de nos collègues, Denise Unal, mais aussi un spécialiste de la situation politique en Turquie qui travaille pour la Brookings, donc il parlera également de Washington. Et cette réunion sera animée par Marie Gégaud, qui est journaliste du Monde en poste en Turquie. Et le 12 mai, nous allons organiser une réunion sur les conséquences de la guerre sur les économies russes et ukrainiennes, qui est un sujet d'intérêt très fort de la part, je crois, de beaucoup de l'audience du club. Et donc, cette séance aura lieu le 12 mai avec Julien Vercueil, qui est un économiste spécialiste de cette région et vice-président de l'INALCO. Merci encore, Romain. Merci à vous d'avoir suivi cette réunion et d'y avoir participé pour certains. Et donc, je vous donne le rendez-vous le 20 avril prochain. Merci, au revoir.